A lonely hunter showed mercy and saved a weakened pregnant wolf. 1 year later they met again, but what the hunter witnessed made him weep. Thomas was a seasoned tracker who lived in a secluded cabin deep in the Yukon wilderness of northern Canada. On a freezing morning, as frost painted intricate patterns on his windows, he ventured out to hunt in the depths of the ancient forest. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved carefully through thick underbrush, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Suddenly, Thomas noticed something unusual in a small clearing ahead. It was a she-wolf lying motionless in the snow, her silver-gray coat matted with ice. Her belly was swollen with unborn pups, and her ribs protruded sharply through her skin. Thomas realized immediately that the wolf was severely weakened and starving. Without hesitation, he pulled from his pack some dried venison he had prepared for lunch. Thomas carefully tossed a piece of meat toward the wolf. She sniffed it, suspiciously, her amber eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and desperation, before swallowing it hungrily. The hunter continued to feed the wolf until she seemed satisfied. As Thomas gazed at the exhausted animal, he wondered what could have happened to her pack. Wolves typically stay together and help each other survive in harsh conditions, but this wolf was completely alone, abandoned in the unforgiving wilderness. Thomas decided to name the wolf Luna, after the moon that had guided him through countless nights in these woods. He understood that Luna was close to giving birth and worried about how she would manage to raise her pups alone in such brutal conditions. The hunter knew he needed to act quickly and decisively. He sprinted back to his small cabin to gather the necessary supplies, his mind racing with plans. When he returned with an axe, rope, and thick blankets, he began to work with determined urgency. He spent the entire day constructing a small shelter near where he found Luna. Thomas carefully selected sturdy logs and branches, creating a robust structure that would protect the wolf from the harsh elements. Inside, he fashioned a soft bed from moss and dried leaves, covering it with warm blankets. He even added pine boughs to the walls for extra insulation against the howling winds that swept through the Yukon nights. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple, Thomas realized it was time to bring Luna to her new home. He slowly approached the wolf and spoke softly to her, his voice barely above a whisper. Luna watched his movements with distrust. Her ears flattened against her head, but she made no move to flee. Perhaps exhaustion had claimed her will to run, or perhaps something deeper told her this human meant no harm. Thomas carefully wrapped her in a blanket and lifted her into his arms. The wolf was much heavier than he expected, her pregnant belly adding significant weight. But the hunter was determined to help her. He carried Luna to the shelter, quietly reassuring her along the way, speaking in gentle tones about the warm den that awaited her. Once inside, Thomas gently placed the wolf on the soft bed, arranging the blankets around her swollen form. From that day forward, Thomas visited Luna every day, bringing her food and fresh water. He brought rabbits, fish from the frozen river, and even some of his own preserved meat. At first, the wolf was cautious, watching him with those piercing amber eyes. But over time, she began to trust her savior. Her tail would wag slightly when she heard his footsteps approaching through the snow. One day, while Thomas was checking on Luna, he noticed a curious black wolf following him through the trees. The hunter was worried that this predator might pose a threat to Luna and her future pups. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle on his back as he assessed the situation. However, his fears were unfounded. The black wolf, whom Thomas named Shadow due to his dark coat and silent movements, was surprisingly affectionate with Luna. Often, he would bring small pieces of food to her, rabbits he had caught or scraps from his own kills, and warm her with his body during the cold nights. Thomas was amazed by the unusual friendship between the wolves and watched with interest as their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Shadow seemed to appear and disappear like smoke through the trees, always watchful, always protective. Thomas wondered if Shadow had been part of Luna's original pack, or if he was a lone wolf who had found purpose in protecting the vulnerable she-wolf. Either way, the hunter was grateful for the additional guardian. Winter was particularly harsh that year. Temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, and blizzards swept through the forest with terrifying frequency. Thomas continued to care for Luna and spent increasingly more time with her, sometimes staying for hours in the shelter. He told her stories about his life in the forest, about the wife he had lost to illness 5 years ago, and about the solitude he had chosen as his companion. This wolf seemed to listen attentively, her amber eyes never leaving the man, occasionally tilting her head as if understanding his words. The hunter, who had always considered himself a loner, unexpectedly found in the wild animal a friend. There was something healing in Luna's presence, something that filled the emptiness he had carried since his wife's death. One evening, a severe blizzard descended upon the forest. The wind howled like a chorus of demons, and snow fell so thickly that Thomas could barely see his hand in front of his face. Despite the danger, he felt restless about Luna's condition and ventured out to check on her. Fighting against the brutal wind, he made his way to the shelter. Upon arriving at the shelter, Thomas was horrified to discover that Luna had disappeared. Panic gripped his chest as he searched the area, calling out to her against the roaring storm. The hunter went searching for her, fighting against the freezing wind that tore at his clothes and stung his exposed skin. His lantern flickered wildly in the tempest, threatening to extinguish at any moment. Soon, he heard a low whimper coming from a small cave nearby, a place he had scouted before but deemed too exposed. Thomas found Luna lying on the cold stones, her body trembling. She was in labor, her eyes wide with pain and fear. The hunter stayed with the wolf, trying to keep her warm and calm in the midst of nature's fury. He covered Luna with his own coat, shielding her from the cutting wind that invaded even the cave's depths. Thomas spent the entire night beside her, whispering encouragement, and witnessed the birth of 4 pups. It was a miracle unfolding before his eyes in that frozen cave. Each pup emerged wet and mewling, and Luna carefully cleaned them with her tongue, despite her exhaustion. By morning, the storm had subsided, and Luna, exhausted but content, was nursing her newborns. Shadow appeared at the cave entrance as dawn broke, as if he had been keeping watch from a distance all night. In the following weeks, Thomas helped Luna care for the pups. He brought extra food so the wolf would have enough milk for her offspring. Shadow also remained by their side, guarding the cave entrance with fierce dedication and playing with the growing pups when they became more adventurous. Thomas enjoyed watching the little ones grow stronger and begin exploring the world around them, their tiny paws leaving tracks in the melting snow. He was particularly fond of the smallest pup, whom he called Scout. This little fuzzy one was the last to try new things, hesitant and cautious, but soon became the bravest explorer of the litter. Scout would venture farther from the den than his siblings, sniffing at every unusual scent and investigating every sound. Thomas often brought small pieces of meat specifically for Scout to help him grow stronger, and the pup would wag his tail furiously whenever the hunter approached. As winter's end approached, the forest became more active with life, returning to the thawing landscape. Birds began to return, and the ice on the river started to crack and break apart. One day, while visiting the wolf family, Thomas heard distant voices and the sound of branches snapping under heavy boots. His hunting instincts told him that danger was approaching, and his muscles tensed with alertness. But something felt different this time. The voices carried an edge of determination that made his blood run cold. Cautiously, he crept through the bushes and saw a group of 5 armed men following wolf tracks in the melting snow. Their faces were hard, determined, and their rifles gleamed in the pale sunlight. Thomas overheard their conversation, and what he heard made his blood run cold. They said they had been tracking a wolf pack for several days, following reports from local trappers about increased wolf activity in the region. The hunters feared that the wolves might attack livestock or even people in the scattered settlements nearby. One of them mentioned a reward being offered for wolf pelts, and Thomas realized these weren't just concerned locals, but men, driven by profit and fear. When Thomas heard the threat to Luna and her family, he knew he needed to act immediately. His heart pounded in his chest as he formulated a plan. He rushed back to the cave where the wolves lived, his boots sliding on patches of ice. Luna was already leading her pups deeper into the shelter, her maternal instincts sensing the approaching danger, and Shadow assumed a defensive position at the entrance, his hackles raised and teeth bared. Thomas heard the voices of the hunters growing closer, their heavy footsteps crushing through the underbrush. When they arrived at the clearing, he bravely stood in front of the cave entrance, spreading his arms wide to shield the wolf family behind him. His weathered face was set with determination, and his eyes blazed with protective fury. "These wolves are under my protection," Thomas declared firmly, his voice echoing through the trees as he locked eyes with the surprised hunters. His tone carried an authority that came from years of surviving alone in this unforgiving wilderness. Startled, the men lowered their rifles, uncertainty crossing their faces. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, recognized Thomas and asked why he was protecting the grey predators. The hunter took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could decide the fate of Luna and her family. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Thomas began to tell the story of how he found the dying wolf and helped her survive the brutal winter. His voice was steady and passionate as he spoke about the birth of the pups in the middle of the blizzard and the extraordinary friendship that had developed between him and the wild animals. He described the nights he spent keeping Luna warm, the food he had shared, and the trust that had grown between man and beast. His words were full of sincerity and conviction, each sentence carefully chosen to paint a picture of compassion rather than threat. Thomas invited the hunters to see for themselves that the wolves were not a danger. He explained how Luna had been abandoned by her pack, likely due to her pregnancy making her vulnerable, and how she had struggled to survive alone. He spoke of Shadow's loyalty and the innocence of the pups who had never harmed anyone. The hunters approached the cave cautiously, their boots crunching softly on the remaining snow. At that moment, the curious scout poked his head out, his fur still fluffy with youth. The men watched in amazement as the wolf pup approached Thomas fearlessly and confidently rubbed against his hand, making soft whimpering sounds of affection. The distrust and fear on the hunters' faces gave way to astonishment and something softer, perhaps wonder. They were surprised by Thomas's compassion and the unique connection between the man and the wolves. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years," admitted one of the hunters, shaking his head in disbelief. Another hunter, younger with red hair, crouched down slowly, extending his hand toward Scout. The pup sniffed it curiously before licking his fingers, causing the young man to laugh with delight. Thomas seized the opportunity and explained that these wolves were just a family trying to survive in a harsh world. He assured the hunters that he was watching them closely and could guarantee they would stay away from the farms and pose no danger to people. He offered to take full responsibility for monitoring their movements and promised to alert the settlements if the wolves ever strayed too close to human territory. After a long discussion among themselves, huddled together and speaking in low voices, the leader of the hunters, the bearded man whose name was Clayton, agreed to leave the wolves in peace. However, he demanded that Thomas assume responsibility for them and make sure they caused no trouble. The hunter agreed gladly, relief flooding through him, knowing he had just become the true protector of the wolf pack. He shook Clayton's hand firmly, sealing the agreement between them. But as the hunters turned to leave, Clayton paused and looked back at Thomas with stern eyes. "One incident. Just one," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that hung heavy in the cold air. "If these wolves cause any problems, we'll be back, and next time there won't be any discussion." When the hunters departed, their figures disappearing into the forest, Thomas turned to the cave. Luna and Shadow stood at the entrance, their amber eyes meeting the man's gaze with what seemed like understanding and gratitude. In that moment, the hunter realized how much his life had changed thanks to these incredible creatures. They had given him purpose again, filled the void that had consumed him since his wife's passing. He was no longer just surviving in the wilderness. He was living with meaning. But Clayton's warning echoed in his mind, a reminder that this peace was fragile and conditional. As spring arrived in full force, bringing warmth and new life to the Yukon forest, Thomas knew it was time to let Luna and her family return to the wild. It was a difficult decision that weighed heavily on his heart, but he understood it was best for their survival and their nature. Wolves were meant to run free, to hunt, to live as their ancestors had for thousands of years. One morning, as the first flowers began to bloom, and the air filled with the scent of pine and fresh earth, the hunter went to the cave to say goodbye to his friends. Luna and the pups were already outside enjoying the warm sunshine that filtered through the new green leaves. Thomas walked slowly toward them, feeling overwhelmed by emotions he had kept buried for so long. The she-wolf wagged her tail in greeting, and the now-grown pups played at her feet, their movements graceful and strong. They had transformed from helpless newborns into magnificent young wolves, each one unique in personality and marking. The hunter knelt down and allowed the pups to approach him one last time. Each of the young wolves took turns rubbing their noses against Thomas's hand, as if wanting to say farewell in their own way. Scout, who had become the hunter's favorite, lingered longer than the others, pressing his head against Thomas's chest as if trying to memorize his scent. Thomas gently stroked Scout's head, trying to hide the tears that welled up in his eyes. His throat tightened with emotion, making it difficult to breathe. Finally, the hunter turned to Luna. He gently scratched behind her ears, the place she had always loved, and thanked her silently for the trust she had shown him and for revealing a new side of nature he had never known existed. Luna licked Thomas's hand tenderly, her rough tongue warm against his weathered skin, as if she understood the profound meaning of this moment. Then, the she-wolf barked softly, a sound that seemed to carry both sadness and determination, and called her pups to her side. They gathered around her obediently, ready to depart into their true home. Shadow emerged from the shadows of the cave, taking his place beside Luna as he had done countless times before. Thomas stood up and stepped back to give the wolves space to leave, his legs feeling weak beneath him. "It's time for you to be wild again," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Live free. Stay safe and remember that you'll always have a friend in these woods." Luna gave one last look at her savior, her intelligent eyes seeming to hold a lifetime of gratitude, and led her family into the forest. Shadow followed after a brief pause, glancing back at Thomas with what might have been respect in his golden eyes. Scout hesitated at the tree line, turning back twice as if torn between two worlds, before finally disappearing into the undergrowth behind the others. Thomas stood in the clearing for a long time, listening to the sound of their paw steps fading into the distance. The forest seemed quieter now, emptier somehow. He was filled with sadness and peace simultaneously, a bittersweet mixture that settled deep in his chest. As he watched the last glimpse of Shadow's black tail vanish between the trees, Thomas whispered a prayer to the wilderness that had become his home, asking it to protect the family he had helped bring into this world. Upon returning to his cabin, Thomas retrieved his weathered journal and began to write the story of his remarkable friendship with the wolves. The words flowed from his pen as if they had been waiting to be released. He realized that this adventure had forever changed his perspective on the forest and its inhabitants. He was no longer just a hunter, taking from the land. He had become a guardian, a bridge between the human world and the wild. 1 year passed, marked by the changing seasons and the quiet rhythm of life in the Yukon. On an autumn day, as golden leaves drifted down from the trees, Thomas was walking through the forest, gathering berries, when he heard a familiar sound. It was a wolf's howl, but there was something special about it, something that resonated deep within his soul. The hunter's heart beat faster as he scanned the area, hardly daring to hope. At the edge of the clearing, he saw a scene that took his breath away and brought tears streaming down his face. There stood Luna, more beautiful and stronger than ever, her coat gleaming silver in the afternoon light. Beside her stood 5 adult wolves, her pups now fully grown and magnificent, and the faithful Shadow, his black coat still as dark as midnight. Luna's howl echoed through the forest, haunting and beautiful. It seemed she recognized the place where Thomas had once saved her life. The familiar surroundings likely brought back memories, and she instinctively called for him. Thomas's eyes filled with tears of joy as he gazed at the wolf family. They looked healthy, powerful, and happy, everything he had hoped for them. For a brief moment, Luna's eyes met the hunter's, and he had the overwhelming sensation that she remembered him, remembered the kindness he had shown her 1 year ago. Luna howled again, and this time her grown pups joined in. Their voices blended into a beautiful, wild chorus that sent chills down Thomas's spine. He laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by this unexpected reunion. The sound filled the forest, a song of survival, family, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the wolves he had saved. The hunter noticed that one of the wolves stood out from the others because of his familiar behavior. He recognized the now adult Scout, who still maintained his playful spirit and curious nature. Scout took a few steps toward Thomas, as if remembering the man who had once cared for him. The young wolf's eyes held recognition and something that looked remarkably like affection. For a few precious moments, the wolf family stood at the edge of the clearing, as if giving Thomas a chance to make sure they were well. The hunter realized that Shadow remained by Luna's side, proving that their unlikely friendship had withstood the test of time and the call of the wild. The black wolf stood proud and strong, a devoted companion who had never abandoned his family. Then, as if on some silent command, Luna turned and walked into the forest. Her pups and Shadow followed her, moving with the grace and confidence of wolves who knew they belonged to the wilderness. Scout lingered for a moment, giving Thomas one last look before disappearing into the thicket behind the others. It was a look of gratitude, of remembrance, of a connection that transcended the boundaries between species. As the wolves vanished from sight, their forms blending into the autumn forest, Thomas's heart swelled with joy and pride. He had always seen himself as just a simple hunter, but now he understood that he had become part of something far greater. His kindness and compassion had not only saved Luna and her pups, but had also changed him forever in ways he could never have imagined. The forest fell silent again, but it was a different silence now, one filled with promise and connection. Thomas stood in the clearing as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He raised his hand in a final salute to the family that had taught him the true meaning of compassion, trust, and the wild beauty of nature. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the autumn wind, he thought he heard one more howl, a farewell and a thank you, before the forest embraced its wolves once more.